This video is sponsored in part by News Voice. What's cyclical? I'm Mr. Beat, I think. You may have heard this famous quote: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The philosopher and writer George Santayana is credited with it, and that quote is a big reason why we have the cliche, "History repeats itself." But does history really repeat itself? Well, since I mostly teach American political history, let's look at it to answer this question. First, I just gotta bring up the Schlesingers and their cyclical theory. Historian Arthur M. Schlesinger and his son, also Arthur M. Schlesinger, developed it and promoted it. Their cyclical theory says that the mood of the country has historically gone back and forth between liberalism and conservatism, kinda like a pendulum. Now remember my political spectrum video and how words like liberalism and conservatism are incredibly misleading? Well, the Schlesingers defined what they meant by, quote, liberal and, quote, conservative. When they said liberal, they meant that democracy was increasing, you should focus on the wrongs of the many, that there was a priority on public purpose and human rights, when the welfare of people is seen as more significant, when experimentation and reform and public activism is encouraged. According to the Schlesingers, conservative means containing democracy, that you can't trust all the masses. It means when the rights of the few are prioritized, that you should do what's best for the private interest and protect property rights, when there is more fear of power being with the masses, and basically more respect to the hierarchy. It prioritizes sober reflection and appreciation for tradition. Anyway, so the Schlesingers argue that the United States would go through this liberal period, then conservative period, then liberal period, then conservative period, back and forth on repeat throughout history. Each phase would wither out, which then led to the opposite phase. The Schlesingers argued the first phase of American history was 1765 to 1787. This is basically from the time of the Stamp Act Congress, or first gathering of colonial representatives to unite in protest against British taxation, and the ratification of the US Constitution. This was a liberal phase due to, the colonists breaking away from Britain and forming their own republic with a very limited government. The Schlesingers said the second phase was from 1787 to 1801, from the ratification of the US Constitution, to when Federalists lost power in the executive branch. According to them, it was a conservative phase since Hamiltonian federalism dominated, and so did merchants. The third phase, between 1801 and 1816, was a return to liberalism, as Jeffersonian democracy took root. 1816 marks the beginning of the fourth phase, and a return to conservatism, as after the War of 1812, the country raised tariff protections, and the federal government took more control with the establishment of the Second National Bank and building roads and canals. 1829 marks the beginning of the fifth phase and a return to liberalism after Jacksonian democracy takes root, and for the first time, pretty much every man in the country can vote. It's also a time when people turn against federal aid to big businesses. The sixth phase, from 1841 to 1861, marks the rise in power of the Whig Party and is another return to conservatism. This is a time when slaveholders get a lot more power in the federal government, and the US military gets more aggressive, acquiring new land through wars and treaties. The seventh phase, from 1861 to 1869, is what I call the Radical Republican era. It is a return to liberalism in which we see the abolition of slavery, the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and other Reconstruction policies to help the newly freed slaves. From 1869 to 1901, in the eighth phase, we see a long period of conservative rule, with big businesses having dominating influence over Washington, D.C., the return of high tariffs, imperialism, and holding on to the gold standard. Liberalism returns with the ninth phase from 1901 to 1919, and is basically the progressive era, although I'd argue progressive reforms really had a lot of momentum in the 1890s 1990s. Here's where we get much more democracy with the 17th and 19th Amendments, referendums, recall elections, and initiatives, which is when ordinary citizens were generally first able to originate legislation. Conservatism returns with the 10th phase from 1919 to 1931. Business interests once again are prioritized during this time. And then of course the country swiftly swings back in the other direction when the Great Depression hits. The 11th phase, a famous liberal phase actually, lasted from 1931 to 1947 and is mostly associated with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies. Now I should pause right here to tell you that Schlesinger Sr. first published his cyclical theory during this period, and so he had to make predictions about the next cycle. He predicted that after 1947, a conservative 12th phase would follow until approximately the early 1960s. That conservative time featured the US once again becoming aggressive with their military abroad and valuing tradition more, and the 13th phase indeed seemed to come in the 1960s, with the country again taking a liberal turn, with lots of government programs to help the poor, civil rights legislation, and the backlash against the Vietnam War, and distrust of government in general. Schlesinger Sr. lived to see the beginnings of this phase, but after he died in 1965, his son, Schlesinger Jr., kept cyclical theory going. Schlesinger Jr. said the 13th phase ended around 1978, when the country once again took a conservative turn with the rise of the Reagan Revolution, deregulation, and supply side economics. Writing in 1999, after realizing the country was still in that same conservative phase, even though it should have predictably ended in the early 1990s, he speculated that conservatism was still dominating due to the rise of computers and the internet. Also, Schlesinger Jr. said there hadn't been a major national trauma for a while. Well, that national trauma came on September 11th, 2001. However, by that time, Schlesinger Jr. seemed to forget about those cycles he and his father had referred to before. After 9/11, the United States arguably remained in a conservative phase. In the final years before his death in 2007, Schlesinger Jr. mostly just brought up his fears about how divided the country had become. So what about today in 2020? Well, I would argue that we're still actually in a fairly conservative period in American history, although there are signs that we may be about to enter another liberal phase. Based on the Schlesinger's cyclical theory, that would make the current phase the longest conservative phase, or any phase for that matter, in American history yet. It's lasted longer than I've been alive. It's important to bring up that the Schlesingers weren't the only historians who supported a cyclical theory with regards to American history. For example, there's this dude named Samuel P. Huntington and his periods of creedal passion. He argued that there are times throughout American history where people get fired up and then rise up to bring dramatic government reforms. There's also Stephen Skowronek and his presidential cycles. There's Frank Klingberg's foreign policy cycles. Heck, both of those deserve entirely separate videos. But my point is, there seems to be different cycles of historians who bring up cycles in history. You may have heard this famous quote: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The philosopher and writer George Santayana is credited with it, and that quote is a big reason why we have the cliche, history repeats itself. But does history really repeat itself? Wait a second, didn't I already say all that at the beginning of the video? Anyway, here's probably a better quote. "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Patterns and cycles do emerge because humans often are not in control as much as we think we are. Just like how individuals are constantly acting and reacting in predictable ways, so do societies. Also, the technology changes, but usually human behavior does not. This is indeed why many historians can predict at least some of the big stuff that will happen in the future." And so, does history really repeat itself? Sometimes, but usually not. But I'm starting to repeat myself here, so What do you think? Let me know in the comments. This video is once again sponsored by News Voice. News Voice is my favorite place to look at the news. It's a free app that is breaking people out of those news bubbles and is revolutionizing the news landscape. News Voice gives you a personalized news feed by aggregating major news sites, including international and independent media. The best part about it? It shows multiple sources for the same stories and tags the bias and perspective of each source. You can upvote stories you find interesting and add stories or links that are missing. So dig deeper and try News Voice by clicking the link to download it in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to News Voice for sponsoring this video. A special shout out to Denis Blinov, who helped me with the research for this video. And to all my American history folks out there, do you think we're entering a new cycle in American history? By the way, I think the rise of populism in recent years makes me think we're in a new populist movement. Call it Populist Movement 2.0. Hey, if you're watching this in 100 years, let me know. Am I right about this? Thanks for watching.